Auntie Claus and the Key to Christmas by ELISE Primavera. Auntie Claus, New York, North Pole. Darlings, the story you are about to be told is absolutely true. It happened on Christmas when my nephew Christopher began to have doubts. Shall we say? The entire family was in a fright uproar and very cross. Well, we couldn't have that, heavens no. So it was up to me to intervene. Now hang up your stockings, darlings, and turn this page, for here is where you will find my key to Christmas. Young Christopher Kringle lived at the Big Cherry Hotel in New York City with his parents, the Kringles, and his sister Sophie. Chris loved going to the Jingle Bell Company, where his father was the president. He spent many happy hours at the Mistletoe Toenail Salon, which his mother owned. But most of all, Chris loved listening to his great aunt, Auntie Claus, tell stories about the Kringle family, the North Pole, and Santa. Dear boy, she would always say, when things seem dark and dreary, if times turn sour and bitter, think like a Kringle. You'll soon find your way to all that sparkles and glitters. But Chris wasn't so sure. Not anymore. For he had begun to wonder about his great aunt. In fact, Chris had begun to wonder about his entire family. Then one day, he overheard a pair of out-of-towners, the Spam Twins, who were saying at the binge while on tour promoting their book, "We're Genies and You're Not." Chris soon learned that Ozzy and Pam were commonly known as the Smarty Pants Spam and had become international sensations. So how could he ignore something they'd said? "Hey Pam," Ozzy sniggered. "It's a week after Halloween and that lady in the Christmas outfit is still in her costume," snickered Pam. "You'd think she was Santa Claus' sister," Ozzy snorted. "Only babies believe in Santa Claus," they chortled. And so it was that exactly 1 week after Halloween, Chris repeated what he had heard, and the entire Kringle family was thrown into a turbulent uproar. Miss Kringle screamed and dropped a full bottle of mistletoe nail polish on the carpet. Mr. Kringle, who was in the process of stringing jingle bells, lost his balance and careened right into the middle of his favorite Christmas tree. "And you call yourself a Kringle? Shame on you," said Chris's older sister Sophie. To no one's surprise, Chris was immediately summoned to Auntie Claus' suite at the Bing to penthouse 25C for tea. "It has come to my attention," Auntie Claus began, "that there is a nasty rumor going around that some children are saying, well, it's unspeakable, preposterous, it's completely unacceptable. Marmalade cake, darling?" Chris squirmed in his seat. "I have never known a Kringle to repeat such things." Auntie Claus paused to stir her tea. "It is time you learned a little family secret. But first, there is something you should know about children who start such rumors." The room suddenly became very quiet. Dark clouds began piling up outside. The truth of the matter is that these children eventually become rather unattractive grown-ups. "Try some lovely cookies, darling." "Unattractive?" Chris asked. "Yes," said Auntie Claus. "These children become grown-ups who enjoy seeing a birthday cake slip off the edge of the table and go splat on the floor. To them, having it rain on the day of a parade is what eating chocolate eclair is to you. And they have just formed a club." "A club?" said Chris. "Yes, darling, a club," said Auntie Claus. "It is called the Parade Rainers United Nations Elite Society, or prunes for short." "Heavens," Auntie Claus continued, "that you, of all people, would say such a thing? Why, I should think you'd rather hurt Santa's feelings." "Do you know Santa?" Chris asked. "Why, of course I know him. The very idea," Auntie Claus said. Sophie rolled her eyes. Chris is going to be on the BB&G list again. BB&G list? Said Chris. Auntie Claus sighed. BB&G, darling, is short for the bad boys and girls. Anyone on Santa's BB&G list goes without presents for Christmas. So unfortunate. But Chris was not convinced. I'll believe it when I see it, he said. That's my motto. Dear boy, don't you know that all the best things are invisible? Auntie Claus said. Sometimes you have to believe it in order to see it. That is my motto. That is the key. At midnight, Auntie Claus left for her annual business trip. And at midnight, Chris was wide awake. Is there really a BB&G list? He thought. I get presents every year. And to be honest, I'm not all that good. There was only one way to find out. Chris had made up his mind. If there really is a BB&G list, my name is going to be on it, he said. And maybe then I'll get to the bottom of this family secret once and for all. The very next day, Chris eliminated please and thank you from his vocabulary. He made rude noises and ate with his mouth opened. He whined whenever it looked like something had better than he did, and regularly squashed his vegetables in his dinner napkin for good measure. He started cheating at board games and screaming if he didn't get his own way. By Christmas Eve, Chris was pretty sure he had covered everything, but he still had doubts. There's no such thing as a BB&G list, he said. There is too, said Sophie. I'll believe it when I see it, Chris said. What if I told you that you got your name off this list last year because you're such a nice sister, Sophie said. You are not, said Chris. I am too, Sophie, and that's not all Auntie Claus. Is Auntie Claus' older sister. She is not, insisted Chris. Is, shouted Sophie. Prove it, demanded Chris. I will, said Sophie, but you'll have to go on a little trip. Fine, said Chris. Sophie grabbed her brother's hand and led him to Auntie Claus's penthouse. Shh, Sophie said as they tiptoed through the dim-lit apartment to Auntie Claus's private elevator. From inside her jumper, she removed a red ribbon necklace, at the end of which was a diamond key. Look, she whispered. The key glittered in her hand. If you don't believe me, Sophie said, inserting the key into the lock of the elevator, then asked Mr. Pudding. The elevator door slid open. I will, said Chris, stepping inside. Who's Mr. Pudding? The door began to close. They say that you're the new elf. Don't forget, Sophie said. Suddenly, the key sparkled and flashed, illuminating the darkness, and flew from her hand into Chris's just before the door shut. What? Said Chris. The doors closed and the elevator began to move. Wait, Chris screamed. Remember, you're the new elf. Sophie's voice faded as the elevator rose higher and higher. I'm the new elf, Chris said as the elevator began to pick up speed. I'm the new elf, he repeated through chattering teeth. The night was getting colder and colder. Chris looked around the elevator and was relieved to see a warm jacket, a hat, a pair of mittens, socks, boots, and trousers all neatly folded in one corner. He quickly put them on and placed the key around his neck. The elevator continued its trip through the starry night. Thunk! The elevator landed on Chris stepped out. I'm the new elf, he said loud and clear. Hello, Mr. Pudding here, head elf in charge of vital rules and information. Good, said Chris. You're just the person I was told to see. Oh dear, oh dear. Who did you say you are? The new elf, said Chris. No, you're not. Mr. Pudding looked closely at Chris. You are Christopher Kringle. Oh dear, oh dear. He pulled out a little red and green book and started to read. At 10:12 a.m. Eastern Time, on November 8th to the 14th, Christopher Kringle made rude noises and on those days did not say please or thank you. Oh dear, let me see. Vegetable squashing, eating with his mouth open. You've got quite a bit of insisting on his own way. Oh dear, December 20th, eating at Candyland? Mr. Pudding escorted Chris out of the gate. Sorry, but it's a rule. Part of the arrival procedures. No BB&Gs, meaning no spoiled brats, no crybabies, and absolutely, positively, no one who doesn't believe, he whispered. Mr. Pudding closed the gate. But, Chris wailed, I was trying to get on the BB&G list on purpose. Oh dear, said Mr. Pudding. And no whiners either. He locked the gates. Mr. Pudding, Chris called. You don't understand. It's not my fault. It's Ozzie and Pam's. Ozzie and Pam's? Some voices said. Chris was startled to see a company of snowboys. You know them, he said. The Spamtoons are members in very good standing, they all replied. Members? Asked Chris. They're international sensations, they added. Can you help me? Chris asked. I've been locked out of Christmas. Locked out of Christmas? Come with us. We're on our way to see the High Head. He'll like you. Yeah, but will I like him, Chris thought? Because these snowboys are already starting to get on my nerves. Down, down, down they marched. It began to drizzle as the snowboy sang, we're spoiled brats, we like to whine. We're prickled as a porcupine. We don't believe in you-know-who, or in reindeer that fly. If we don't get our own way, we'll scream, we'll bite, we'll cry. Yes, we're on the list every year until we're 21. But we don't care, because being bad is just too darn fun. And when we're all grown up, we'll have one great big goal, to turn your sparkling diamonds into little lumps of coal. In short, we love to burst balloons. Our heroes, Ebenezer Scrooge. And why is that? Because we're Ozzie and Pam, some voices said. Chris was startled to see a company of snowboys. Prunes, Chris whispered. Welcome, said the High Head. There was a flash of lightning. There aren't snowboys, Chris thought. They're prune boys. Now he could see that not only was the BB&G list real, but his name was the first one on it. There was a clap of thunder, and it began to rain. Lovely, said the High Head in a booming voice. What can I do for you, my boy? You see, it all started with Ozzie and Pam, Chris started to explain. He was beginning to think that maybe those smarty pants spams didn't know how much after all. Ozzie and Pam spam, said the head prune. Fine children. Cream of the crop. Cream of the crop? Your royal pruneship, said the prune boys. As I was saying, I was locked out of Christmas, Chris continued. Locked out of Christmas? I'm not sure that even the Spamtoons could manage that, said the head prune. They wouldn't even try. Oh, pruniest one, said the prune boys. You're a fine example of a BB&G, said the High Head. State your name, and like the spams, you can be a lifetime member guaranteed. Member? Schmember. I want to go home, Chris thought. He was even beginning to miss Sophie. I'm Christopher Kringle, Chris said. As in Santa Claus, said the prune. Yes, replied Chris. The prune boys started to giggle. We don't believe in Santa Claus, they snickered. I'm Christopher Kringle, Chris said louder this time, and I do. Phooey, we don't believe in you, jeered the head prune. Just at that moment, Sophie's key sparkled and flashed in a dreary prune light, and it reminded Chris of something he had heard many times but had forgotten. If times turn sour and bitter, think like a Kringle. You'll soon find your way to all that sparkles and glitters. I'm not a prune. I'm a Kringle, Chris said, and I'm absolutely positively there is a Santa Claus. A hush fell over the prune headquarters. And I don't believe in you, Chris shouted. Something extraordinary was happening. Where the prunes began to shrink, Chris couldn't believe his eyes. Now look what you've gone and done, wailed the head prune. Christopher Kringle, Chris shouted again as loud as he could. The head prune and his prune boys were shriveling up fast now, shriveling up like, well, prunes. Then some really strong magic happens, just as in Auntie Claus's poem. The sour prunes, coal that had been collecting in the prune's hall for ever so long, was changing from dark and bitter lumps into diamonds that sparkled and glittered. Chris found himself whirling around and around through the air at a dizzying speed, in a blur of prune purple into bright Christmas green. He closed his eyes. When Chris opened his eyes, he saw he was standing once again outside the gates. A clock struck midnight and the gates opened. Santa Claus circled above and landed. Ho, ho, ho. Welcome to Christmas, Santa said. Merry Christmas, Santa, Chris shouted. Then from behind the sleigh, out stepped Auntie Claus. Chris exclaimed. My one and only big sister, said Santa. Couldn't get through a Christmas without her, right, lads? Hooray for Auntie Claus, everyone cheered. Turning to Chris, Auntie Claus winked and said, I knew you had it in you, darling. They climbed into the sleigh and headed for the grand ballroom. But there was one thing Chris wondered about. Santa, he said, did you happen to get any letters from a couple of twins? Before Santa even heard him, Auntie Claus handed Chris 2 letters. Not surprisingly, they were neatly identical. Just as Chris finished reading them, a gust of wind blew the letters out of his hand. He watched as they vanished into the dark, snowy night. From the desk of Oswald Spam. Dear Santa, I have been a very good boy, and I think you should bring me lots of presents, but don't bring me any from my sister, 'cause she doesn't think you're real. Your friend, Ozzy. The sleigh entered the grand ballroom, and there was Chris's parents and his sister, Sophie. Merry Christmas, everyone, Chris called to his family. So, do you believe me now? Sophie asked her little brother. Chris took Sophie's diamond key and placed it back around her neck. Like I always said, think like a Kringle, Chris said. His cheeks were red and his eyes sparkled. He's so much like his uncle, his parents said proudly. A real chip off the old block, said Auntie Claus. But shouldn't Chris get a key too? Sophie asked. Chris smiled mysterious and replied, I did get a key. Dear boy, Auntie Claus patted his head. There's no doubt about it, darling, she whispered in his ear. And from that day on, there never was, believe it or not. Auntie Claus, New York, North Pole. So as you can see, everything turned out just fine. Recently, I asked Christopher, do you remember the year that you learned about our little family secret? He chuckled and said, yes, I do. But that year, I received the best Christmas gift ever. To believe is the key to Christmas. Yes, the key, darling. The one that can't be seen, but then all the best things are invisible. Love and Merry Kringle, Auntie Claus. The end.